They say that sometimes history does not knock at the front door. It comes in quietly through the back of the house, sits at the kitchen table, and waits for the elders to notice. Tonight, in living rooms and church halls from Brooklyn to Brixton, from Kingston to Atlanta, many of our elder sisters are noticing a young African captain whose face they have never touched, but whose spirit they recognize as if he were family. Picture it, my brothers and my sisters. Gray-haired Caribbean women leaning forward in their chairs, the light dancing on their cheeks, tears gathering at the corners of eyes that have seen too many funerals and too many prison gates. As this young leader speaks of dignity, of courage, of standing upright in a crooked world, one grandmother whispers, "He looks like the son the system took from me." This is not politics. This is memory. This is grief. This is a question rising in the hearts of our elders. If you carry this same question in your spirit, subscribe, stay close, and walk with us through this story. Because what these women are about to say may change how you see a generation. There are moments when a room becomes more than a room. It becomes a vessel, a sanctuary, a place where memory gathers itself like a storm preparing to speak. And on that Sunday afternoon, inside a small Caribbean church in Brooklyn, that is exactly what happened. The sun had already begun its slow descent, spilling a golden light across the wooden pews. The air held the scent of incense, old prayer books, and the faint sweetness of coconut oil clinging to the scarves wrapped around the heads of the elder women who had gathered. Sister Marlene was the first to arrive. She walked slowly, leaning on her polished wooden cane, each step a testament to the years she had carried. She greeted the others with her soft whisper of, "Bless you, child," and took her usual seat near the front, the place where she could see clearly, both with her eyes and with her spirit. Not long after came Mama Claudette, her hands roughened by decades of hard work, yet her touch still tender. She carried a small bag of homemade fritters, the kind she had always brought to meetings at the church, because feeding others was her way of keeping her own children alive in memory. Following her was Miss Gloria, tall, elegant, and wrapped in a green and gold shawl that danced like fire when she moved. And then there was Aunt Thelma, the oldest among them, her steps slow but her presence commanding, like a bell calling the congregation to attention. They had gathered, as they often did, to discuss the affairs of home Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, but also the affairs of their sons and grandsons, the young men who had faced the weight of the world before they had even learned how to rise inside it. Some of those sons were still alive, wrestling with poverty, violence, or the grinding machinery of a system that had never been built for them. Others had been lost along the way. The silence that followed their names was the silence of graves, of unspoken prayers, of regrets that never found closure. On that day, however, the meeting had a different purpose. A small projector had been set up against the white wall at the front of the room. Someone had brought a laptop. Someone else had said, "We must watch this together." And so they did. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their breaths slow, their hearts cautious, as the image of a young African captain flashed onto the wall. The room shifted. The air thickened. Something ancient awakened. He stood there, on the screen, in his uniform, speaking about dignity, sovereignty, and the right of his people to stand tall. His voice was steady, controlled, yet it carried a fire that made the elders straighten their backs. The cadence of his words was not the cadence of power for its own sake, but the cadence of duty, of responsibility, of a man who had been shaped by the weight of history. For the first time that afternoon, the elders stopped fidgeting. They became still. Sister Marlene leaned closer. "Listen to the strength in that child's voice," she murmured. "It is not the strength of pride. It is the strength of purpose." Miss Gloria nodded, pressing her shawl to her chest. "He reminds me so much of my grandson Elijah, the one who went away, the one who never came back home." The others knew the story. They had heard it many times. But that day it felt different. It felt heavier, as though the young man on the wall had reached into the past and touched the memory of Elijah with a hand made of light. Mama Claudette wiped her eyes, though no one had yet begun to cry. "I keep thinking," she whispered, "what would life have been if our boys had been given room to become themselves, instead of being told what they could not be?" The video continued. The captain's words carried the rhythm of a man who knew the truth of struggle, yet refused to bow before it. One of the women whispered the phrase, "Ibrahim Traore moment," almost without realizing she had said it. It slipped from her tongue like a prophecy, like a marker placed upon the timeline of their collective memory. As the video played, something unspoken began to pass between the women. It was not simply admiration. It was not political interest. It was recognition, the kind that strikes the heart like a drumbeat, echoing through years of loss. Aunt Thelma was the one who broke the silence. Her voice trembled, but it carried the authority of 9 decades. "That young man," she said, "moves like the sons we were never allowed to keep. The sons we lost to guns, to prisons, to poverty, to a world that did not know how to love them." A quiet gasp rippled across the room. Something holy had been named. The projector's light flickered across their faces, revealing lines carved by hardship, but also a softness that had survived despite it. Each woman saw something slightly different in the young leader: a child, a memory, a wound, a possibility. Yet all of them felt one shared truth rising like incense. Hope, fragile but real. The video reached a powerful moment, but before it could continue, the projector glitched for a second, the screen freezing on the young captain's eyes. Eyes filled with intensity, resolve, and something else. Something that made the elders lean forward, as if they were hearing a voice calling their names from a long distance. And then the screen went black. Gasps burst through the room. Someone cried out softly. The sudden silence felt almost divine, as though the universe itself had paused to give them a choice: to walk away or to follow the emotion stirring inside them. They did not yet know what the next part of the video would reveal. They did not yet know how deeply it would shake their spirits. But they felt it coming, like thunder rolling across the sea. And that is where we must pause. Because what happened next inside that small Brooklyn church was something none of them were prepared for. When the screen flickered back to life, it did so with a sudden burst of color, as though the room itself had inhaled sharply. The projector hummed, the shadows settled, and the elders fixed their eyes once more upon the wall where the young captain stood framed in light. His voice returned, not loud, not boastful, but steady in a way that commanded the heart to listen. In that moment, something shifted in the room. Sister Marlene leaned forward, gripping her cane as if it were an anchor in a rising tide. "Hear him," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the generation of women who had carried the weight of broken homes and slain children on their backs. Hear the truth in that boy's voice. The captain on the screen spoke of dignity. He spoke of his people rising after decades of struggle. He spoke of standing upright when the world expected kneeling. And each word, each pause, each breath sank into the chest of the women gathered in that Brooklyn church. At first, the reaction was quiet, a soft hum, almost like the start of an old hymn. Then Mama Claudette pressed her palm against her heart, as if something deep inside her had suddenly awakened. "My Christopher spoke like that once," she murmured, voice trembling, "before the system took his spirit and crushed it piece by piece." Miss Gloria reached out, gently placing her hand upon Claudette's shoulder. "My darling," she whispered, "it is as if this young man carries the strength our boys were never allowed to keep." As the captain continued, the camera in the video shifted to capture him addressing a crowd, his hands moving with a controlled passion. The elders in the room felt the rise of his conviction, as if it were a wind lifting their chests. It was then that a single phrase spread between them, unspoken yet understood. He was not simply leading his people. He was giving voice to every black child who had ever been silenced. The volume rose slightly, revealing a crescendo in his speech. Words like sovereignty, courage, and memory rolled across the room like waves pounding the shoreline. The atmosphere thickened. A hush fell, sacred and heavy, and then a sound broke from the back of the room. It was not a cry. It was not a shout. It was a wail, ancient and powerful, the kind of sound only a mother who has buried hope can make. Aunt Thelma rose from her seat, her hands trembling yet lifted toward the image on the wall. At 90 years old, she stood taller than she had in decades, her voice shaking but ringing like a cracked church bell. "He is carrying them," she cried. "All the sons we lost. All the sons the world never let grow." The women gasped. Some placed their hands over their mouths. Others pressed their palms together in prayer. Tears streamed down cheeks carved by time. And then the preacher, like electricity, swept through the room. Miss Gloria stepped forward, her shawl glowing in the projector's light. "Do you not see it?" she proclaimed. "This is why our hearts recognize him. This is why our spirits respond. This is why the whole diaspora has been moved by this Ibrahim Traoré reaction. He is the child the world tried to deny us." A murmur rose like a rising choir. "Amen. Yes, child. Speak it." The young captain on the screen raised his voice at that exact moment, speaking of unity, discipline, and the sacred responsibility of leadership. The timing was uncanny, as though he had heard the cries of the women thousands of miles away. Sister Marlene pressed her hand against her forehead. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, shaking. "This is the first time in 20 years I have felt a spark of hope for our boys." Mama Claudette began to sob openly, her shoulders trembling. "If my Christopher had a leader like this," she whispered, "if he had been shown dignity instead of suspicion, maybe he would still be here." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a fierce, collective release. Some women clapped. Some lifted their hands in praise. Some bowed their heads, letting tears drip silently onto their lap. For a moment, the church felt like a temple of resurrection. Wounds long hidden were rising. Grief long buried was speaking. Hope long starved was stretching its limbs. The video continued, reaching its own climax, the young captain declaring a message of self-respect and unity. Every elder felt the words echo inside their bones. They were not hearing a foreign leader. They were hearing the echo of every bright-eyed sun the world had tried to dim. And then something extraordinary happened. A young woman in the corner, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly stood. She was not part of the elder circle. She was not yet 30, but she trembled as she spoke. "Aunties, is this what leadership is meant to feel like? Is this what our generation has been missing? Her question cut through the room like lightning. The elders froze, for this moment was no longer about memories or past losses. For the first time, it was about the future. It was about what might happen next. It was about who might rise if they dared to believe again. And so the room fell into a charged silence, waiting for the next revelation, the next breath, the next truth that was about to break open their world. When the silence settled inside that little church in Brooklyn, it did not settle as an ending. It settled as a beginning. A beginning none of the elders had anticipated when they first gathered with their bags of fritters, their scarves tied neatly, and their hearts carrying decades of quiet sorrow. What happened next did not simply remain in that room. It traveled, as truth often does, across borders, across oceans, across generations. It began with Sister Marlene. She was the one who insisted they should not keep the experience to themselves. If something touches your spirit, she said, you must allow it to breathe. You must allow it to walk. And so she asked the young woman in the corner, whose question had shaken the air, to make a short recording explaining how the room had felt, what the women had seen, what they had cried for, and what they had remembered. The young woman, whose name was Leona, hesitated at first, but Aunt Thelma placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Child," she said, "if the elders do not speak, the truth will starve. You speak for us. Your generation must hear this." And so Leona recorded a simple 2-minute message on her phone. She spoke softly, describing how she had watched a room of Caribbean grandmothers transform in front of her eyes, how she had seen mourning become memory, and memory become a rising force. She spoke of the grief they carried, the sons they had lost, and the sense of recognition that had filled the room when the captain appeared on the screen. She ended her recording with a question, trembling yet sincere. Why did it take a man thousands of miles away to remind us of what our boys could have been? That question struck something raw. Within hours, the video left the church and entered the digital world. Someone posted it to a small Caribbean community group. Someone else shared it with a cousin in Toronto. A pastor in Miami forwarded it to his congregation. A retired teacher in Kingston sent it to her WhatsApp list, writing, "Listen to the spirit in this. Listen carefully." By nightfall, hundreds had seen it. By morning, thousands. The movement of the message was organic, almost spiritual, as though it traveled on the breath of ancestors who had been waiting for such a moment. Caribbean elders in London began commenting, remembering their own sons who had fought battles with poverty, bureaucracy, racism, and despair. Former nurses, retired bus drivers, fishermen who had once lived in Trinidad or St. Lucia, but now lived in New York or Birmingham, wrote messages describing how the young captain's composure reminded them of the strength their people had always carried, yet rarely been allowed to display. But it did not stop with the elders. Young people began to react too. Black American teenagers in Atlanta found the clip and commented with astonishment. Haitian students in Montreal shared it with tears in their eyes. A Jamaican-American veteran in Florida wrote, "My mother is 84. She cried when she watched this." Soon, community centers began organizing small gatherings, not political meetings, not strategy sessions, but conversations about manhood, dignity, and leadership. Conversations that had been dormant for far too long. At a Caribbean cultural center in Toronto, an elder named Papa Reynolds showed up unexpectedly and shared his story. He spoke of raising 2 grandsons who had been swallowed by the streets before they understood their worth. He spoke of regret, not the kind that torments, but the kind that seeks healing. And when the video of the captain played, he whispered, If my boys had been given a mirror like this, perhaps they would have recognized themselves. In Miami, a group of retired teachers gathered at a community hall. One of them, Miss Hyacinth, pressed a photograph of her son to her chest as she spoke. "I am not praising a leader I do not know," she said. "I am honoring the memory of a child I knew too little. This young man reminds us of the greatness our sons were never taught to see in themselves." At the same time, Caribbean churches across the United States began referencing the message in their sermons. Pastors described a longing for a generation of young black men to rediscover purpose, dignity, structure, and compassion. They used the story of the Brooklyn elders as an example of what collective recognition could spark. The conversation began to take shape. Was this about politics, or was it about something deeper? Was it about leadership, or was it about the wound carried by mothers across the diaspora? Was it about a man, or was it about a memory? That question echoed from city to city, community to community. And slowly, quietly, a new sense of expectation began to rise. The elders were no longer speaking only of the past. They were speaking of the future. They were asking if their grandchildren might live in a world where young black men are taught to stand tall, not apologize for their strength, and lead with dignity. But not everyone agreed. Some feared the consequences of placing hope in a figure so far away. Some questioned what this awakening might mean for the balance of power. Some wondered whether the younger generation was ready for such responsibility, and that is precisely where the true tension began. Because the ripple spreading across the Caribbean diaspora was about to collide with voices beyond their community voices across America and across the world. Before we go further, I must ask you, do you believe this awakening among Caribbean elders is the beginning of a deeper shift, or simply a passing moment? Because what happened next would draw the attention of people far beyond the islands, the boroughs, and the church halls where this story began. The ripple that began in that small Brooklyn church did not stay within the familiar embrace of Caribbean households. Waves seldom obey borders, and neither did this one. Within a few days, voices in the United States and across the Atlantic began reacting to the growing chorus of Caribbean elders, women who had spoken with a clarity that could not be ignored. What started as a whisper among mothers became a conversation among scholars, journalists, and community leaders. In Atlanta, Professor Delroy Hastings, a respected Caribbean-American historian, spoke during a televised interview. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and said, "This is not simply admiration for a young leader abroad. This is the reopening of an old wound. Caribbean mothers are crying not for a man, but for the sons they buried in silence." His voice trembled, echoing the weight of generations. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a panel of commentators debated the sudden surge of attention. Some dismissed it as nostalgia, a longing for the past. Others warned that it revealed something uncomfortable about life in the West. The absence of leaders who command respect through discipline, purpose, and moral clarity. But among all these voices, one stood out. Reverend Jonas Price, an elder himself, who said on national radio, "The Caribbean mothers are recognizing a quality they have begged for in their own homes' integrity. Do not mock their tears. Listen to them." Across the ocean in London, Caribbean communities living in Brixton and Peckham gathered for discussions of their own. At a modest community hall, Miss Eudora, a retired nurse from Antigua, spoke softly. "For years our boys have been told that their strength is a threat, not a gift. Now the mothers are seeing someone who carries strength with dignity. It is shaking them, because it reminds them of what could have been. European journalists began to take interest. Articles appeared in Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam, analyzing the emotional reaction spreading across Caribbean diasporas. Some writers called it diasporic memory resurfacing. Others described it as a quiet revolt of mothers reclaiming the right to hope. But regardless of terminology, the sentiment was clear. These women were not merely reacting to a leader. They were responding to a mirror. In Canada, the reaction deepened the conversation. A group of Caribbean Canadian youth in Toronto hosted a small forum, inviting elders to share their stories. One young man, shaken after hearing the testimonies, said, "We never knew how much our grandmothers carried. We never knew they thought about us this way." And when a clip from the Brooklyn gathering was played, several young people sat upright, listening intently. They had never seen their elders respond to anything with such raw emotion. Even scholars in Africa began writing responses. A professor in Ghana suggested that the emotional connection between Caribbean mothers and the young captain represented a relinking of the spiritual cord severed by centuries of displacement. Though his words were academic, the meaning was deeply human. The diaspora was remembering itself. Yet beyond all the commentary, one truth stood out. The reaction among Caribbean elders was exposing something in the global Black community that had gone unnamed for far too long. The longing for leaders who embody discipline, compassion, and moral courage. Leaders who could heal wounds instead of reopening them. Leaders who remind people of their worth, not their limitations. And as the world watched this stirring among mothers and grandmothers, a quiet question began to rise. If these women were finally finding a symbol of dignity, what would they ask the world to do next? Because the elders were not finished. They had one message left, own message powerful enough to echo across continents. The message that Caribbean mothers carried into the world did not arrive as a demand, nor as a political statement. It arrived as something far older, far deeper, a prayer shaped by experience, grief, and unbroken hope. These were women who had buried dreams, women who had kept their families alive on faith alone, women who had spent lifetimes loving sons the world refused to see. And now, as their voices echoed across continents, they were ready to speak a final truth about the path ahead. It was Mama Claudette who articulated it first, during a follow-up gathering at the same Brooklyn church. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "We are not chasing a hero," she said. "We are remembering the kind of men our boys were meant to become. This is not about replacing what we lost. It is about guiding what still lives." Around her, the elders nodded. Sister Marlene folded her hands. Miss Gloria pulled her shawl tighter. Aunt Thelma, frail yet fierce, sat upright as though preparing to deliver a benediction. The elders agreed on one thing. The future could not be built on pain alone. It had to be built on transformation. At another community meeting in Toronto, a retired school principal named Mr. Lennox stood and offered a thought that spread like fire. "If the mothers are waking up," he said, "then the fathers must wake with them. The uncles must rise. The young men must listen. The girls must know their worth. A whole community must lace up its boots and move forward." In Miami, a multi-generational circle formed around a simple idea: rebuilding dignity from the inside out. Younger men asked what discipline looked like. Elders explained that discipline was not punishment, but purpose. Younger women asked what strength looked like. Elders explained that strength was not aggression, but responsibility. It was a quiet, steady process. Lesson by lesson, decade meeting decade. Across the Atlantic in London, Brixton elders spoke with youth groups who had never known a sense of shared cultural direction. An elder called Miss Bernadette reminded them, "We cannot control the world, but we can control the people we choose to become. If we want a better tomorrow, we must raise it ourselves." For the first time in many years, the diaspora began imagining a future together rather than surviving separately. They imagined mentorship programs, elder youth circles, cultural education, mental health support, leadership training, spaces where young Black men and women could rediscover confidence shaped by history rather than erased by it. And woven beneath all these ideas was a single spiritual thread. Healing must be collective. Healing must be intentional. Healing must be chosen. The mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and widows of the Caribbean diaspora believed that the future did not belong to one leader or one movement. It belonged to everyone willing to stand upright after generations of bending. They believed in a horizon shaped not by fear or nostalgia, but by courage and memory. Yet, as this new vision began to take shape, a question emerged, quiet at first, then growing with every conversation, every gathering, every whispered prayer. If the Caribbean mothers see a path forward, will the rest of the world be brave enough to follow? Because the journey ahead was not simple. It required something many communities had forgotten how to hold. It required unity. And unity, as the elders knew, is the hardest miracle of all. There are moments in history when a community exhales after holding its breath for far too long. And as the voices of Caribbean women spread across Brooklyn, Kingston, Toronto, Brixton, and Atlanta, something sacred was happening. These women who had held the memories of their sons in silence, women who had carried the weight of unspoken grief, were standing again. Not in defiance, but in remembrance. Not in fear, but in revelation. For them, this was not simply about a young captain appearing on a screen. It was about the reawakening of dignity, the return of a language they had almost forgotten how to speak. Sister Marlene said it quietly during one gathering. When we saw him, we remembered the boys we prayed for, the boys the world never understood, and in her trembling voice, one could hear the echo of every Caribbean mother who had ever waited at a window for a son who never came home. This was an Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because of politics, but because of memory. This was an Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because of admiration, but because of healing. And somewhere in the middle of this awakening, people around the world began asking why Caribbean women were responding so fiercely, why their tears came so quickly, why their voices shook with both grief and hope. The answer, of course, was simple. They recognized something familiar. Something they had seen in the eyes of their own sons when they were still untouched by the world's hardness, something they had been praying to see again. Across the diaspora, young people continued to share videos of the elders. Many wrote comments saying they had never witnessed their grandmothers express such raw truth. Some called it a spiritual awakening. Others called it a reckoning. And a few, moved by the sincerity of the elders' emotions, described it as the most honest Ibrahim Traoré reaction they had ever seen. But beneath every conversation, there was a deeper question rising, one that stretched beyond continents and generations. What do we wish to build from this moment? Do we want a future where young Black men grow with discipline, purpose, and dignity? Do we want communities where mothers no longer fear losing their sons to systems that do not see them? Do we want unity that is not borrowed, but earned? If the answer is yes, then the path forward begins with us, all of us, choosing to believe that the healing of a people can begin with the tears of its mothers. And so, my brothers and my sisters, if this story touched your spirit, If you felt the weight of those elders' voices, if you saw even a shadow of your own family in their tears, then do not just watch. Walk with us. Stand with us. Add your voice to this circle. And if you feel called, press subscribe so you never journey alone. Before you go, tell us in the comments. Do you believe this awakening among Caribbean women can inspire a new generation of leadership across the diaspora?